So now that all of that is out of the way, we can actually jump into the product animation side of things now, and then move on to the product rendering and all of that juicy good stuff. So let's start off by setting up our can here to actually be ready for product animation. So first things first, all of these objects here, they're actually disconnected. So what we want to do is basically join this all up so it's one single object. Easiest way to do that is if you just select everything here. So let's select the little pin, the tab here, and also the lid, and then finally the can. Once all of that's selected, you can hit Control and J, and what that is going to do is basically add it all together as one object. When we move this around, it's going to all move together, whereas before, if we moved it all around, it would not come with us. Alright, so now that we've got the can all set up, we can actually start moving on to the product animation, which is going to be done using an empty object to control all of the keyframe data and things like that. So before we create the empty, I'm just going to set the origin of the can. So if you right click it, set origin to geometry. That's just going to make the can's origin a little bit more precise. And now what I'm going to do is add in an empty object to control the can. So if we go Shift A, empty, I'm going to use a cube. What we can do now is just bring this up and basically align it to the can. There we go, something like that. So now all of the movement that happens with the can, we want this to happen when we are moving the empty object. So the very easy way to do that is just simply parenting this object to this object. So if we click the can, shift click the empty, and then if we hit Control P, we can set the parent to object. So now when we start moving this empty object, the can's actually going to follow what the empty object is doing. So what I'm going to do now is just bring up the timeline here so we've got a little bit more space to work in. And with the can and the empty selected, I'm just going to duplicate this twice. So Shift D to create one extra can, and then Shift D to create another extra can. So now we have 3 cans to start playing around with. So first off, let's actually name these empties so that we know what they are. So empty 1, let's just call this, let's hit F2 and call this can underscore 1. For empty number 2, let's just hit, for the second empty, let's hit F2, call this can underscore 2. And then the fourth empty, let's hit F2 and call this can underscore 3. So now we have can 1, 2, and 3. So what we want to do is basically, in this timeline, we're going to create keyframes at specific spots to create the animation. So now we're going to make that dynamic shot of the camera zooming out and rotating, and having the cans also move around and rotate and do some cool stuff. So to begin with, let's first off select the time range of our timeline. So over here, we can choose how long we want this animation to go for. So let's just say that this is a 24 frame per second animation. I'm just going to type in here 24 times 5. So that's going to make 5 seconds of animation, which is 120 frames. So if we want this to be a 5-second animation, we can just simply type in here 120, and that's going to reduce the timeline to 120 frames. For me, however, I want this to be a little bit more snappy. So I'm going to change this to 24 times 3. So it's just going to be a 3-second animation for this introductory shot. So let's make that 72. And now we can actually start playing with the animation and creating that cool dynamic shot. So let's move the playhead back to frame 0. And what I'm going to do is actually click on the camera and then come down here to this little dot, which is auto keying. So if we click that, we've now got auto keying enabled, which means anything we do at all, let's say for example I'm going to move the camera into the Red Bull logo, you can see down here it's created a keyframe. So if we move back to frame 72 and I bring this out to reveal the cans, you can see we've now got this sweet animation, and we didn't have to click any keyframes in or do anything. It's just automatically done it for us, which is pretty awesome. So I'm just going to, before I continue with the camera's animation, I'm I'm just going to delete these two keyframes and I'm going to adjust the camera settings. So first off, I can see it's already on a slight angle. So I'm just going to level out this rotation here to 90, like so. And I'm going to level these two out as well. So I'm going to change Y to 0 and also Z I'm going to change to 0 for the rotation. For the location, I'm just going to leave it as is because we're going to be animating that on the fly. So now I'm just going to push this in to be front and center with the Red Bull can. I'm just going to move it over a slight bit. And you can see the depth of field is a little bit intense here. So I'm just going to change that out here. So I'm just going to turn that off for now, and if it feels like it needs it at any given point, I'll turn it back on and play with the settings then and really refine it. But for now, we're just focusing on the actual animation. So to begin with, we've got it starting at frame 0. We're just going to move it over to frame 72, pull the camera out to reveal the cans, and you can see that's created the animation for us here. But we do want to have the camera rotating 360 degrees. So the easiest way to do that is just to come over here to frame 72. You can actually jump through each keyframe by pressing up and down on your arrow keys. So at frame 72, I'm going to come up here to the camera's object properties, and we're just going to change the rotation of the y-axis 360 degrees. So just type in 360, and now you'll see it's got that dynamic rotation shot here. I'm seeing in the animation, however, there's that tiny gap where you can actually see below the plane here. So I'm just going to select it, and I'm going to move this edge out beyond the camera's view. That way it's not going to pick it up in the final animation. There we go. So very dynamic shot, but it's very bland and very slow. So I'll show you shortly how to fix that in the graph editor. But for now, let's actually create the Red Bull can animation. So for can 1, I'm just going to select that. I'm going to go back to frame 0. We're going to press G and click, left click, and that's going to create a keyframe here. And then I'm just going to go all the way back to frame 72, and I'm going to pull it forward slightly, like that. So now we've got the can pushing out, and for these two cans, they're going to fly out from behind the can and create that dynamic shot. So back to frame 0, I'm going to select can 2, and press G to create a keyframe. Then I'm going to go to frame 72, and what I'm going to do is just move it across outside of the other can so it comes into view. And a quick way to actually make this symmetrical is you can hold down Control while moving, and you can see it's snapping to the grid. I'm just going to move it across 1.5 meters. And then for can 3, basically we're going to do the same thing. Back to frame 0 here, I'm going to press G and create a keyframe for it. Then I'm going to go back to frame 72, and I'm just going to move it across 1.5 meters in the X axis. So now we can see this is what the animation is looking like at the moment. But we actually want these cans to be spinning as they shoot out from the back. So for these two guys on frame 72, we're just going to rotate it on the Z axis, like so. So for this guy, I'm just going to make it negative 360. And then for this one here, I'm going to make it positive 360 rotation. So now you'll see they're slowly rotating out as they come out of view from behind the can, which is pretty cool. And I'm just noticing now I don't actually want them all looking directly at the camera with the same rotation. I actually want these two at the back to be slightly off, so it's not so symmetrical and there's a little bit of asymmetry in there. So for this one, I'm just going to rotate it slightly out like so. And then this one here, again, a little bit more, just like that. So now we have this playing as the animation. You can see as we're playing the animation, it's very slow, and also there isn't a lot of easing in or easing out. It's just very linear. And that's because currently everything, if we select everything and we select these two keyframes, you can hit T on your keyboard and you can see the interpolation, it's not actually set to anything. So it's just using the default, which is linear. So what we can do is we can change this over to Bezier, and immediately it's going to be looking a little bit better but we can obviously improve this a heck of a lot. So what I'm going to do is just down here in the timeline, I'm just going to come over here and change over to the graph editor. If you want a quick way to switch between these two screens, you can hit Shift F6 to go to the graph editor and Shift F12 to go to the timeline. So now that we're in the graph editor, I'm just going to select the camera to start with, as well as these three empties. So can 1, can 2, can 3, and you'll see all of their keyframe data is now selected in the graph editor. So with all of that selected, you can hit the period key on your numpad, and that's going to shrink everything down to view. So now with everything selected, what we can do is we can scale the curve to make it really stand out when it's animating. You'll see in a second what I mean. So if we try to scale it now, it's not going to work as intended. You can see it's doing a lot of weird and wacky things. But if we come over to the pivot point here, we can change this to individual centers. So now instead of it doing that weird stuff, we can actually just scale it in like so. And it's going to scale relative to the pivot point of the keyframe. So I don't know if you can see yet, but what I'm doing now is I'm scaling in, and it's basically squishing the curve together and creating the ease in and ease out effect, but it's just amplifying that. So you'll see when I hit play, it's really dramatically changed how fast it's going to go through that middle part of the animation. It's almost too much right now, so I'm just going to decrease it slightly, and you can see already that's made a heck of a lot better animation so far. So now it's basically just a matter of refining this till something that you enjoy. So I generally tend to play around with the curves quite a bit just till I get something that suits the client's needs. For the camera, I'm just going to come back now and enable depth of field. And I'm going to play with how much depth it has. So you can see if we really crunch that down to 0.1, it's going to create that super dynamic look, but it's kind of inhibiting the product. So I'm just going to pull that out to something like 0.7. I'm just going to see how that looks. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. I might even bring it up to 1 meter and we'll go with that. So this is looking pretty good so far. That's basically shot 1 complete. What I'm going to do, however, is I'm going to create that extra little twist at the end. So to do so, we're going to need some more frames to animate with. So I'm just going to bump this up to 120. Don't think we're going to need all of that frame animation. I'm just going to pull this to frame 92, and I'm going to animate the camera zooming out just a tad bit more and also rotating just a tad bit more for that dynamic look. So now when we play this animation, it's going to look something like this. So just looking at this, I may even bring the animation playhead back just a tad bit more to something like frame 85. So let's go to frame 85 here. And let's just select this keyframe and move it across to frame 85. Give that a little preview. And that's looking a lot more dynamic already. So last thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to go back into the graph editor, and I'm going to crunch these keyframes down a little bit more. Something like that. And that's looking pretty good. Alright, so now moving on to shot 2 of the product animation. What we can do to really quickly copy this scene and create different keyframe data and animations is we can come up over here to the scene, and you can click this button here, new scene, and it's basically going to create a copy. So if you click that, we can just do full copy, and now that's going to copy absolutely everything from that previous scene that we just created. So now that we have a completely new scene, let's just start off by renaming it. So we can call this shot 2, and we can call this one here shot 1. So a good thing to note is that everything material wise is going to be linked. So for instance, if I change the material of the background to something like white and we switch over to shot 1, you'll see it's stayed the same. So what we're going to need to do is make separate materials for each scene, if we are changing them at least. So for shot 2, we're just going to keep basically everything the same, so we don't need to worry about that. But what we are going to do is basically going to create an array of cans that's going to form a floor, and then we're going to animate some cans rolling over the top of it. So let's just start by first off going over to our layout section here, and I'm just going to select everything, go back to frame 0, I'm going to delete all of their keyframes. So now with that done, what we can do is I'm just going to grab can 3 and can 2. I'm just going to open them up here. Basically, we're just going to delete all of this. So we've only got one can here. So with this can selected, I'm just going to create an array modifier of the can. So we come over here to the modifier tab, come over to add modifier and click array. What we can do is we can increase the count to something that we need. So you can see it basically goes on forever if we however many cans we want to add in. But I'm first off noticing that the rotation is incorrect. So I'm just going to press Alt and R. And that's going to fix the rotation for us. And I'm also seeing that they're basically touching each other in the center there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the relative offset factor. So if we just increase this just a tad, something like 0.06, now we can see we've got those cool gaps. So before we continue, I'm just going to set up the camera and make sure that it's actually looking down from a top view onto all of the cans that we're going to create. So with the camera selected, I'm just going to rotate it. I'm just going to press Alt R to reset its rotation. I'm going to bring that up like so. And now I'm just going to rotate it on the Z axis -90 degrees. And now we've basically got a little playground for us to set up our cans in. So with the can selected, I'm just from the camera's perspective setting this up. So just about there seems good. And now back to the modifier tab for the can. I'm going to increase the count to 5. Looks like that encompasses everything. And then, because we need it to go this way as well, I'm just going to duplicate the array modifier. So you can just come here to the tab, the drop down tab, or you can just hit Shift D. That's going to duplicate it. And now with array, the second array, we can change the factor to a different axis. So you'll see immediately this is what we're looking for, -y. So I'll just go -1, -1.06. There we go. And for the count, I'm just going to increase this until it encompasses the camera's view. So it looks like 10 seems pretty good. So now that we've got the cans down pat, you can see immediately we've got a bit of repetition going on with the cans tabs. So we need to basically rotate each one individually. But if we try to do that right now, you'll see it's doing everything at once. And that's because we're still in a non-destructive workflow and we're using the array modifiers still. So to do so, we're just going to apply these array modifiers that we've created. So if we come down here, you can just click on apply, or you can just hit Control A, and that's going to apply it. So now that we've got this applied, it's still its own one object. And to fix that, all we need to do is go into edit mode and separate the cans. If you go into edit mode, select everything, hit P, and then do separate by loose parts. You'll see now that everything is separated into its own individual can. The only issue here is that it's even separated the top of the lid as well as the tab and the nail. So basically all we need to do now is rotate all the tops of the lids and make them feel like they haven't just been copy pasted like they have been. So first off, we need to change the origin point because as you can see, it's currently still at the origin point of the original can. So if you just hit A on your keyboard to select everything, you can right click and then go set origin to geometry. So now we can come in, we can select each of these here, we can hit R and Z, and we can basically just rotate it. You'll see it's updating in the camera's view to look a little bit more realistic. So I'm just going to speed through this now and I'll see you after that. Alright, so now we've got all the cans roughly rotated and they all look basically like they've been randomly placed there now. So now we can move on to the animation side of this and basically create the empty that's going to roll over this view and have all those cans rolling with it. So let's start off with first off creating a can for us to animate. So I'm just going to grab these three guys here. I'm going to Control J them so that they're all one object. And then I'm going to Shift D and bring that up above the cans. Awesome. So you can see it's still parented. So I'm just going to Alt-P and clear the parent. So now that it's got no parent objects, we basically just need to create a new empty for it to use. So I'm going to go empty. I'm going to go with cube and just bring that up and basically scale it to size. Awesome. So now let's just parent this one. So click the can, Shift P, click that, and set parent to object. Now basically what we're going to do is I'm just going to rotate it so that it's on its side here like this. I'm basically just going to push the can across the screen. So as you can see, when I'm trying to move it on the axes, it's not following the local axis of the empty object. So a quick way to fix that is you can just hit G and then double tap the axis that you want it to be following. So for instance, if we go G and then hit Z, that's using the global axis. If we hit Z again, it's going to use the axes of the empty object, which is pretty cool. So what I'm going to do here is just going to line it up like so. And then for frame 0, I'm just going to move it off screen a little bit more. So I'm just moving it on the Y axis. And then I'm just going to move over to frame 72. Just going to quickly change the timeline's frames to 72. And now I'm just going to animate this basically moving across the screen, and then I'll animate in the rolling. So on frame 72, I'm just going to move this like so. And I'm going to do my best to make sure that it lines up so that it's starting at here and ending here as well. So something like this. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that'll do. So now we're basically needing to animate the rolling of the can. So this is where the empty object comes in handy. We basically need the empty to be rotating to show that it's rolling, but try and do the rotating on the Z axis, which is where we would need it to be rotating. You'll see when we actually play, it's doing some really weird interpolation, and that's obviously not how a Red Bull can would roll across the top of this. So what we need to do is actually just animate the can itself. So if we just hit R and then Z twice, let's just do 360 degrees of rotation. You'll see now the can is actually rotating, but it's also following the form of the empty object as well. So that's pretty cool. Obviously we need to increase the amount of rotations it has, so let's just go R, Z. I'm hitting Z twice to do its local rotation. Let's do 720 rotation here. And you can see already that looks way better. Okay, so I'm just going to give it a few more rotations. So I'm just doing 360 times 3, so 1080 for the rotation, and that looks much better. And now we basically just need to duplicate this a couple times to create that sort of array of rotating cans across the top. So let's grab the empty and the can. I'm just going to do Shift D. And now at the beginning and the end, we need to just move them slightly away from one another. So in frame 0, I'm just going to move this duplicated can across now. Like that. And then on frame 72, we basically need to do the same thing. So I'm just moving it across on the x-axis, and then I'm going to change to the local axis by hitting Z twice. So G to move, press Z twice, and now I'm moving on their local axis. And now if we hit play, you'll see we've got two cans rolling across the screen. Pretty cool. Obviously we're going to need to offset the rotation because this one, they're basically doing it in uniform, which looks kind of weird. So what we can do to do that is, if we hit this one here, we can change their initial rotation. So instead of the first can starting at 0 rotation, I've just changed it to -180. And you'll see it's definitely offset it, but we need to also offset the end frame. So basically it'll just be 1080, minus 180. So that's where it'll stop. And now they'll be rotating at the same pace, but they've got a different offset and it looks a lot more natural. So now I'm just going to speed through this and do that again for a bunch of cans. And I'll see you once I've finished up that. So I've made this array of Red Bull cans now, and you can see it's looking pretty cool. Basically, yeah, I've just changed their rotation so that they're all offset, so you can see at no given point are there any that are really symmetrical. Apart from maybe these last two, I'll just quickly update that one. So 49.9. There we go. So we've got a really cool dynamic shot to elevate this secondary shot of our sequence here. The only thing I'm seeing here is that it feels a little bit too slow. So let's just change the frames of our animation here. So let's just go with a 2-second shot here, so 48 frames. And quickest way to change that is basically just select everything and grab the keyframe here and just push it down to frame 48. So now instead of it being kind of slow, now it's going a lot faster. I may even just play with this a little bit more and change it out to something like frame 60. It was just dragging on a little too long, I felt like, for that 72 frame shot. That's looking pretty good, so I think I'm just going to leave it there, and we can now move on to shot 3.